Judge Thomas Hardwick had spent over 2 decades in the courtroom, his reputation solidified by his unwavering commitment to justice. With his carefully combed hair, pressed suit, and a demeanor that demanded respect, he was a man who prided himself on making decisions based purely on the law. His day typically consisted of landlord-tenant disputes, minor code violations, and occasional domestic cases. It was all quite predictable, and Hardwick preferred it that way. He found comfort in the order of his job. There were rules, and they were meant to be followed. As he scanned the docket for the morning, his eyes briefly landed on the name Lisa James. A quick glance at her case file gave him the impression that this would be another standard housing issue. A property owner accused of not meeting certain legal standards, likely an oversight, maybe some paperwork missed, or a minor violation in the renovation process. Hardwick barely read through the details. The case seemed routine enough. The property in question was a modest rental complex, and the accusation appeared to be a result of negligence regarding maintenance codes. He had handled similar cases countless times before. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Lisa James entered the courtroom, stepping forward with a quiet, confident grace. The stark contrast of her presence to the sterile, gray walls of the court wasn't lost on Hardwick. She was a black woman in a field where individuals like her were rarely seen in leadership roles. As she stood before the judge, Hardwick assumed she was just another owner, perhaps someone unfamiliar with the complex legalities of property management. He prepared himself for the standard defense: an apology, a promise to fix the problem, and a request to reduce the fine. "Ms. James," Hardwick began, without much interest, "you are here today regarding a violation of building codes at your rental property. Is that correct?" Lisa nodded politely, her eyes steady but not intimidated. "Yes, Your Honor. But there's more to the situation I'd like to clarify." Hardwick raised an eyebrow, uninterested in anything beyond the facts. "I'm listening," he said, ready to hear her attempt at an explanation. Lisa took a breath and, in a calm but assertive voice, explained the issue. "The property in question is part of a much larger initiative I oversee, a federal program focused on providing safe, affordable housing to underserved communities." Hardwick's mind clicked into place. "I see. So you're the owner of the building, a landlord." She smiled slightly. "Not exactly, Your Honor. I am the director of several federal housing projects, and the property you're referring to is part of a larger initiative to ensure safe housing for those in need." Hardwick paused, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. He wasn't expecting that answer. But his job was to stick to the case at hand, not to delve into anyone's life story. "Very well," he said, proceeding with the case, but now his interest was piqued, even if just a little. As the case unfolded, Judge Hardwick's mind began to shift from the mundane task of overseeing a routine violation to something that felt, well, a bit more complicated. Lisa James continued to explain, her voice steady and clear. "This project is part of a federal initiative to rehabilitate and manage safe housing complexes across multiple cities," she said, her words carrying a weight that Hardwick hadn't anticipated. "The violation in question is a paperwork oversight regarding an inspection that's in process. The issue has already been addressed, but due to bureaucracy, it's taking longer to complete than expected." Hardwick glanced at the papers in front of him again. He had expected a simple explanation, but this was far from it. The more Lisa spoke, the more he realized this wasn't just about one building. This was part of something much larger. He shifted in his chair, still trying to process the implications of her words. "Ms. James," he said, his tone softening slightly, "you're telling me this violation is part of a larger government program, and that it involves more than just this one property." Lisa nodded, maintaining her composed demeanor. "Yes, Your Honor. I oversee more than a dozen housing projects across the country, funded through federal initiatives aimed at providing secure living spaces for families facing homelessness or unsafe living conditions." Hardwick, though still skeptical, found himself listening more intently now. He had seen these kinds of programs mentioned in the media, large government-funded initiatives designed to help low-income families, but he hadn't thought much about the individuals behind them. He had always assumed that those in charge were bureaucrats, disconnected from the actual impact of their work. But Lisa didn't strike him as a distant figure. Her knowledge was detailed, and she spoke with a sense of responsibility that Hardwick could feel. "So, you manage these properties for the government?" he asked, his curiosity now overcoming his skepticism. "I do," Lisa confirmed. "I'm responsible for ensuring that the properties meet all federal guidelines for safety, maintenance, and accessibility. It's a highly regulated field, and we have to follow strict codes to provide quality, long-term housing for families." Hardwick's brow furrowed slightly as he processed this new information. This wasn't the image of a negligent landlord he had initially imagined. Still, he couldn't quite shake the notion that there had to be some oversight. After all, every program had its flaws. And yet, he began, this paperwork issue still led to a fine. Lisa didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. It's a minor mistake, but it's being corrected. The goal is always to improve, not to burden those who are trying to make a difference." Hardwick sat back, considering her words. This wasn't just a case of an owner skimping on legal responsibilities. This was a woman who had dedicated her life to providing safe housing for people in need. His mind began to shift, and for the first time, he wondered if he had misjudged the situation. Judge Hardwick's thoughts were interrupted as Lisa continued to speak with quiet authority, her words unfolding a narrative he hadn't expected. "The work I do isn't just about maintaining properties," she said, her gaze steady but earnest. "It's about providing families with more than just a roof over their heads. It's about creating a space where they can thrive. Many of the people we help come from backgrounds of instability, and it's not just about fixing a broken pipe or repainting a wall. It's about helping them build a foundation for their futures." Hardwick couldn't help but feel a shift in his perspective. He had always seen housing as just housing, simply a matter of codes, inspections, and legal compliance. But what Lisa described went far beyond that. This wasn't about bricks and mortar. It was about lives, futures, and the kind of stability that many of his constituents would never understand. She paused briefly, as if considering how much more to reveal. Then, leaning slightly forward, she added, "I manage these projects across several cities, Your Honor. We're working with at-risk communities, from single mothers trying to escape violence to veterans seeking a stable home after years of service. The violation I'm here for is small, an issue that, if I'm honest, was more a result of the red tape we have to navigate. But the bigger picture is how these homes impact people's lives." Hardwick stared at her, his initial assumptions crumbling. He thought of his own home, comfortable, secure, and how easy it was to forget that many people didn't have that same privilege. Yet here was a woman, leading efforts to change that for dozens of families across the country. The more she spoke, the more he realized how little he knew about the real work that went into these initiatives. To his surprise, Hardwick felt a small pang of shame. He had entered this courtroom prepared to issue a fine, perhaps out of routine or even because it seemed like the right thing to do in the face of a violation. But here was Lisa James, a woman who was far from the typical defendant in his courtroom. She wasn't just a landlord or a property owner. She was overseeing something much larger, something that touched the lives of people who were often overlooked. His fingers lightly tapped against the wood of the bench as he pondered her words. His mind began to wander, considering all the families in his own city who might benefit from such initiatives, and how many people like Lisa were working tirelessly behind the scenes. "So," Hardwick said slowly, his voice betraying a hint of something closer to respect, "you're telling me this project you oversee is one of many, and you're not just managing buildings, but people's lives." Lisa nodded. "Exactly. It's about creating a real, long-lasting impact. Ensuring these families aren't just surviving, but thriving." Hardwick leaned back, the weight of her words settling in. He had no idea just how much he had underestimated her. and her work. The courtroom felt strangely still as Judge Hardwick listened to Lisa's words, the usual hum of paperwork and shuffling officers all but fading into the background. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the woman standing before him with the initial assumptions he had made about her. She wasn't the kind of person he'd typically associated with federal housing programs. Bureaucratic, detached, focused more on policy than on people. But everything she said seemed to refute that notion. Her work was deeply personal, aimed at the very real needs of vulnerable families. As the hearing paused for a brief recess, Hardwick's staff immediately went to work, digging into Lisa's background. The more they learned, the more surprised they became. The file revealed that Lisa James wasn't just a project manager. She was the director of a federal housing initiative that spanned multiple states. She was responsible for overseeing dozens of housing projects, all designed to provide safe, secure, and affordable living spaces for families facing financial hardship. These weren't just ordinary apartment complexes. They were part of a national effort to combat homelessness, improve housing standards, and give people a chance to rebuild their lives. The more they uncovered, the more Lisa's work began to shine. She wasn't merely an administrator who signed off on papers. She was a visionary, creating partnerships with local governments, community leaders, and nonprofits to ensure that each project was not only functional but also sustainable. Her approach was holistic, addressing not only the physical condition of the buildings, but also the social and economic conditions of the communities around them. She worked closely with tenants, ensuring that they had access to social services, job training, and educational opportunities. One of the more surprising details that emerged from the research was that Lisa had personally led the redevelopment of several dilapidated neighborhoods, turning them into thriving communities. The project she had overseen had received national attention, with experts in the field praising her innovative strategies. Some of the properties had even won awards for their design and impact. It was clear that Lisa's role went far beyond the mundane tasks of managing properties. She was reshaping lives, building communities from the ground up. Hardwick stared at the file, his earlier skepticism giving way to a growing sense of awe. He realized that, in his initial rush to judge, he had dismissed the true scope of her work. This wasn't just a case about minor paperwork or a violation. It was about the profound difference one person could make. When the court reconvened, Hardwick's perspective had fundamentally changed. He no longer saw Lisa simply as a defendant, but as someone who was doing the kind of work that could transform entire neighborhoods. He now understood that the situation in his courtroom wasn't a simple matter of legal technicalities. It was a moment to reflect on the kind of impact Lisa was having on society. Looking up from the file, Hardwick turned his attention back to Lisa. "I've had my staff gather some more information about your work," he said, his voice uncharacteristically softer. "And I must admit, I'm impressed." As the court recessed for a break, Judge Hardwick found himself seated at his desk, alone with his thoughts. The usual hum of the courtroom had faded, leaving only the soft rustling of paper as he reviewed Lisa's file once more. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. How had he so quickly judged her based on a case that seemed, at first glance, so insignificant? Hardwick was no stranger to making quick decisions. After all, that's what a courtroom demanded: speed, efficiency, and a sense of order. But as he sat there, staring at Lisa's credentials and accomplishments, he began to feel a creeping discomfort. Her work wasn't just about following rules or enforcing regulations. It was about people. Real people. Families who were struggling to survive, often overlooked by society. And Lisa was providing them not just with shelter, but with hope, stability, and the opportunity to rebuild their lives. The more he thought about it, the more his previous assumptions felt not only inaccurate, but unfair. When he had first seen Lisa, he'd assumed she was just another person who had neglected her responsibilities, a simple case of someone failing to maintain their property. He had thought her work with the federal housing program was nothing more than paperwork, a distant, impersonal role. But now, as he learned about the scale and the depth of her work, he realized how little he truly understood about the challenges and complexities involved in providing safe housing. It wasn't as simple as issuing fines for violations. It was about making the right decisions that could affect hundreds, even thousands of lives. Hardwick thought back to his own upbringing, his own comfortable home, his easy access to education and healthcare, and he began to feel a sense of guilt creeping in. How had he been so quick to dismiss Lisa because of her race, because of his own biases about who might be responsible for projects of this scale? Was it because she didn't fit the typical mold of a powerful figure in the real estate world? Her skin color, her gender, he couldn't help but wonder if they played a role in how he had initially perceived her. He turned his thoughts inward. The idea that someone like Lisa, someone who was actively changing lives, might be subject to unfair treatment or snap judgments in a courtroom troubled him deeply. This wasn't just about one mistake or one violation. It was about the larger issue of how people were perceived based on their backgrounds, their roles in society, and their appearances. In his position as a judge, Hardwick knew that his job wasn't just to follow the letter of the law, but to understand the broader implications of his decisions. By the time the court session resumed, Hardwick had made up his mind. He no longer saw this as a simple case to resolve. It had become an opportunity to correct his own mistakes, to recognize the value of the work Lisa was doing, and to take responsibility for the biases that had shaped his thinking up until now. The judge had no idea just how much this case was going to change him, but he was determined to make sure it would be for the better. As the courtroom doors swung open, signaling the end of the recess, Judge Hardwick stood up, feeling a sense of responsibility heavier than usual. His previous composure had given way to a deeper reflection on the words and work of Lisa James. When the court reconvened, he could feel the shift within himself, a shift he wasn't entirely sure how to articulate yet, but one that had fundamentally altered how he viewed both the case and its defendant. The room settled into silence, and Hardwick cleared his throat, addressing Lisa with a new, thoughtful tone. "Ms. James," he began, his voice steady but softer than before, "I've had the opportunity to review the details of your work. To say that I was unaware of the scale and impact of your efforts would be an understatement." Lisa, ever composed, met his gaze without hesitation, the quiet strength in her demeanor speaking volumes. "Thank you, Your Honor. I understand how a case like this might seem like a minor issue, but it's part of a much larger effort to provide people with the stability they deserve." Hardwick nodded slowly, a shift in his thinking now evident in his manner. "I've been in this courtroom for many years, and I've seen my fair share of cases. But what I didn't realize, what I failed to appreciate, is the weight of what you do. The housing projects you oversee are not just about compliance with the law. They're about improving lives, families, and entire communities. What you're doing is no small feat." There was a long pause, and Lisa seemed to absorb his words before responding. "Your Honor, I'm just doing my part. The real work is done by the families who fight every day for a better life. They're the ones who deserve recognition." Hardwick shook his head. "That may be true, but the work you do gives them that chance. You're creating a platform where they can rebuild, not just housing, but hope. I can see that now." His gaze shifted to the case file once more, a quiet sense of regret settling in. "You've been dealing with red tape, bureaucracy, and setbacks that most people never see. Yet here you are, doing this crucial work without fanfare." The courtroom sat in a contemplative silence as Hardwick continued, his words deliberate. "This isn't just about a paperwork issue or a violation that needs to be corrected. This is about recognizing the efforts of someone who is genuinely trying to make a difference, and that deserves more than a fine or penalty." Lisa's expression softened. "I never expected anything more, Your Honor. I've faced skepticism before, and I understand that people don't always see the big picture, but I do my job because it matters." Hardwick took a deep breath, the weight of his earlier assumptions heavy on his mind. "I apologize if I've underestimated you or your work. I've come to realize that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future, and what you're doing is far more important than I initially thought." The words weren't just a formality. They were genuine, and they hung in the air like a promise to do better, to see more clearly, and to make decisions not based on assumptions, but on understanding. Lisa nodded, not in agreement, but in quiet acknowledgement that sometimes change starts with a simple shift in perspective. The courtroom was still, the air charged with an unspoken tension as Judge Hardwick's words resonated in the space. Lisa, who had been composed throughout the proceedings, seemed to absorb the shift in tone with quiet dignity. The respect in Hardwick's voice was unmistakable. As the judge sat back down, he paused for a moment, taking in the weight of what he had just acknowledged, his own biases, the complexities of the system, and the very real work that Lisa James was doing in communities that were often ignored. Hardwick wasn't sure exactly how this case would end, but he knew he couldn't just move forward with business as usual. This wasn't a case that could be resolved by simply issuing a fine or enforcing a rule. It was about something deeper, something that called for reflection on how justice was truly administered and what it meant to serve those who were most in need. He turned to the attorneys present, signaling for them to come to the bench. "Counselors," he began, his voice now steady and deliberate, "this case has taken on a different dimension for me than it originally appeared. Ms. James is not here for a typical landlord-tenant dispute. She's overseeing federal housing projects that have a significant impact on communities in need. This is not just a question of minor paperwork violations. It's about understanding the full scope of her work." He turned to Lisa, who stood with a quiet grace, awaiting the judge's decision. "Ms. James, I want to commend you for the incredible work you're doing. The impact of your projects is not just felt in buildings. It's felt in the lives of people who are often left behind." Lisa looked at him, her expression calm but her eyes shining with something close to gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor. I believe in the work I do, and I do it because it matters. I don't seek praise or recognition. I just want to see change happen where it's needed most." Hardwick nodded, impressed once more by her humility. He turned his attention back to the attorneys. "Given the circumstances, I believe the fine is unnecessary. This case will be dismissed, and I want to explore alternative ways of addressing the paperwork issue that will allow Ms. James and her team to continue their important work without further legal obstacles." The attorneys exchanged surprised looks, but Hardwick's decision was clear. He was no longer going to enforce the fine that had initially seemed like a standard penalty. Instead, he would find ways to support the efforts of someone who was striving to make a real difference in people's lives. As the proceedings concluded, Lisa stood for a moment, processing the unexpected turn of events. This wasn't just a legal victory for her. It was a moment of recognition that her work mattered, that it had a place in the larger conversation about justice and society. Hardwick, too, had come away from this case transformed, realizing that justice wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding the deeper implications of those rules and the lives they affected. Lisa had come to court expecting a routine violation to be settled, but she left with something far more valuable, a new ally in her mission to create lasting change. And for Judge Hardwick, this case was a turning point, a reminder that the law, while necessary, was just one tool in the pursuit of true justice. In the weeks that followed, Judge Hardwick found himself reflecting on the events of that day, the case that had changed his perspective more than any other in his career. The decision to dismiss the fine and acknowledge the broader scope of Lisa James's work wasn't just a matter of one courtroom case. It was a shift in how he viewed the very role of justice in society. He had always believed that the law was a tool for fairness, a means to uphold order and protect individuals. But now, Hardwick understood that justice wasn't always black and white. It was about context, understanding, and compassion. Lisa's work, which had initially seemed so distant and bureaucratic to him, now felt deeply personal. He had underestimated the challenges that came with overseeing federal housing programs, not just the legal ones, but the emotional and social ones as well. He saw more clearly now that these projects weren't just about fixing buildings. They were about fixing lives. They were about providing hope to people who had little to cling to, offering them a chance to rebuild not just their homes but their futures. The ripple effect of his decision extended beyond the courtroom. Hardwick began to speak more openly about the case to his colleagues, urging them to consider the human element in their judgments, especially when it came to matters of housing and social welfare. He even started reaching out to local government officials, inquiring about ways he could support initiatives like Lisa's and advocate for policies that supported the most vulnerable communities. His shift in thinking didn't just stay with him. It became a conversation that spread across his professional circle, opening doors to new ideas about how justice could be more inclusive, more understanding, and more compassionate. For Lisa, the dismissal of the fine was a small victory in the larger battle she fought every day. But it was one that affirmed her belief that people, even those who initially doubted her, could change their minds when given the right perspective. She received a number of calls from other local officials and leaders, some of whom wanted to learn more about her work and explore ways to collaborate on future projects. While she had always known the value of her work, the recognition from someone like Judge Hardwick brought a sense of validation that went beyond the courtroom. It reminded her that there were people who saw her work for what it was, not a simple legal obligation, but a lifeline for the people who needed it most. As the months passed, Lisa continued to lead her projects with the same passion and commitment, and while the fine was long forgotten, the shift in perspective it had sparked in Judge Hardwick remained with him, influencing not just his decisions in the courtroom, but his view of the world beyond it. The case had ended, but its impact, for both of them, was just beginning to be fully realized.